Mark Turner was the kind of father everyone thought they knew: quiet, hard-working, devoted to his little girl, until one night he drove her to an empty parking lot, left her barefoot and clutching a stuffed animal, and vanished into the darkness without looking back. On a quiet Friday evening, the town of Willow Creek was settling into its usual routine. Families were finishing dinner, porch lights flickered on, and the streets began to empty as the weekend crept in. But not far from the main road, in a wide and poorly lit parking lot, something was unfolding that would soon capture the entire community's attention. A single figure, small and fragile, was spotted moving hesitantly between the shadows of parked cars. It was a 10-year-old girl, dressed in pajamas that looked far too thin for the cool night air. She clutched a stuffed animal tightly against her chest, as if it were the only thing anchoring her to safety. The call to the police came quickly. A concerned resident, unsure of what they were seeing, dialed in to report a child wandering alone at such a late hour. To them, it looked wrong, unsettling, even dangerous. When officers arrived, the girl was standing still near the edge of the lot, her eyes darting between the empty road and the distant glow of storefronts. She wasn't crying, but there was something about the way she held herself, quiet, withdrawn, almost frozen, that unsettled the officers immediately. At first, the mystery seemed simple yet alarming. How had a young child ended up here by herself? The area wasn't a place where kids played or families gathered. It was a lonely stretch of asphalt on the edge of town, surrounded by shuttered shops and dim street lamps. The kind of place where silence clings to everything, broken only by the sound of passing cars in the distance. To the officers on the scene, it didn't look like a spot where anyone would accidentally leave a child. As they gently approached, they noticed that she was barefoot, her steps hesitant whenever she shifted. The stuffed animal she carried looked worn, its fur rubbed down from years of being held too tightly. She gave her name in a quiet, almost rehearsed voice. And though she didn't explain much at first, the little information she offered was enough to cause alarm. It became clear that this wasn't an accident or a case of a child wandering from home. Someone had brought her here, someone had left her. Word of the discovery spread quickly, as it often does in small towns. Even before the police had finished questioning the girl, neighbors who lived nearby had already begun to gather outside, whispering in worried tones. Who would do this? Where were her parents? Why here, and why now? The questions hung in the air without answers, adding weight to the strange silence of the scene. The image of that child alone in the dark, holding onto her stuffed animal as if it were her last lifeline, left a lasting impression on everyone who saw it. The police knew immediately that this was not going to be a simple welfare check. This was the beginning of something much bigger, a story that was only just starting to unravel. And as the officers took the girl into protective care, the small town of Willow Creek had no idea that what they had just witnessed was the first chapter in a disturbing case that would soon reveal secrets far darker than anyone expected. The hours following the discovery of the girl brought more questions than answers. Once she was safe in protective custody, investigators began piecing together the fragments of her story. She was able to share one crucial detail: her father had been the one to bring her to the parking lot. It wasn't a case of her getting lost or wandering too far from home. She had been driven there, placed on the ground, and left behind as the car sped away. The realization struck investigators hard. A parent abandoning their own child wasn't just shocking, it carried a weight of betrayal that made even seasoned officers pause. To confirm what the girl had said, detectives turned to the surrounding businesses. Though most were closed at the time, security cameras still watch over the empty streets. It didn't take long to find what they were looking for. The footage was grainy, but the truth was undeniable. A mid-sized sedan rolled into the lot, headlights cutting through the darkness. The vehicle came to a stop, the rear door opened, and a small figure stepped out. Within seconds, the car pulled away without hesitation. The child remained behind, standing alone in the glow of the parking lights as the taillights of the car disappeared into the distance. That single clip became the anchor of the investigation. It confirmed the girl's account and set a timeline for what had taken place. Even more startling, investigators identified the driver as Mark Turner, her father. He wasn't a stranger to Willow Creek. In fact, he was someone many locals thought they knew. Mark had been living in town for years, raising his daughter after separating from her mother. To most, he was quiet, polite, and hard-working. There was no history of criminal behavior, no whispers of violence, nothing that suggested he was capable of such a cold act. Neighbors remembered him as the man who kept to himself but always waved when passing by. He took his daughter to school regularly and appeared at local grocery stores just like everyone else. That was what made the footage so unsettling. If Mark was the kind of father who appeared attentive in public, why had he suddenly abandoned his child in the middle of the night? Nothing about his actions screamed panic, but there was a strange tension in his behavior, something deliberate, as if he was following through on a plan already set in motion. When police attempted to locate Mark after the abandonment, he was nowhere to be found. Calls went unanswered, and his home stood dark and silent. Inside, the house looked surprisingly tidy, but investigators noticed small details that hinted at something more troubling. Clothes were missing, drawers emptied, and certain personal items no longer there. It was as though he had been preparing to vanish. For the community, disbelief quickly turned into fear. The image of the little girl being left behind lingered in everyone's mind, and the realization that her father had simply driven away without a second thought left residents shaken. What could push a parent to walk away from their own child, and more importantly, where had he gone? The search for Mark Turner had begun, but already it was clear that finding him would not be easy as the search for Mark Turner intensified. Investigators turned their attention to the life he had left behind. On the surface, everything about Mark appeared ordinary, but as detectives dug deeper, cracks began to show. Records revealed that he had recently lost his job at a manufacturing plant where he had worked for nearly a decade. His dismissal wasn't due to misconduct, but rather downsizing, a fate shared by several others. Still, for Mark, the timing couldn't have been worse. He was already behind on bills, and with no steady income, the weight of financial pressure began to mount. At home, the signs of struggle were clearer than most realized. Neighbors had noticed small changes over the past year. The once well-kept yard had grown over. Lights inside the house seemed to stay off for long stretches, and Mark's car, usually parked neatly in the driveway, sometimes sat idle for days at a time. Few thought much of it then, chalking it up to the normal ups and downs of life. Now, in hindsight, those details painted a very different picture. Even more telling were the records uncovered from social services. Months before the incident, teachers at the girls' school had raised concerns. They noticed she often came to class in the same clothes, her homework was incomplete, and she sometimes fell asleep at her desk. When asked, she would say she was tired or had been hungry. These reports led to quiet monitoring of the household, while no serious action had been taken. The pattern suggested neglect that was slowly escalating. Behind the walls of that modest house, life wasn't as steady as it seemed. Friends of Mark described him as a man who rarely asked for help. He wasn't the type to share his struggles openly, preferring to keep problems to himself. But investigators discovered a troubling shift in his behavior in the weeks before he abandoned his daughter. He had sold several personal belongings, including tools, electronics, and even furniture, often for far less than their value. The money he collected wasn't being spent on debt or household needs. Instead, bank records showed he had emptied what little savings he had and withdrawn cash in small increments, enough to avoid raising suspicion. The portrait of Mark that emerged was no longer that of a struggling father who made a desperate mistake. Instead, it looked increasingly like a man planning something deliberate. His decision to leave his daughter in a place where she would be found suggested he didn't want her lost forever. But it also highlighted his desire to break free from his responsibilities entirely. It was a choice that balanced on the thin line between cruelty and calculation. By the end of the week, investigators were no longer just searching for a missing man. They were unraveling the hidden life of someone who had been preparing, piece by piece, to walk away from everything he once called his own. The calm, hard-working father the town thought they knew was gone, replaced by a figure shaped by secrecy, desperation, and a plan that was only beginning to reveal itself. The trail left behind by Mark Turner grew more intriguing as investigators followed every lead. With the confirmation that he had been withdrawing money in small amounts and selling his belongings, detectives were certain that his actions weren't impulsive. The parking lot drop-off of his daughter looked less like a spur-of-the-moment decision and more like a step in a larger plan. The question that lingered was what exactly he had been preparing for and why he had chosen this path. Police traced his car through traffic cameras and toll records. Slowly mapping out his route after he drove away from Willow Creek, the trail led across state lines, confirming suspicions that he had no intention of returning. But what unsettled investigators most was where his car eventually turned up abandoned near a bus terminal in a neighboring state. Inside, the vehicle was mostly empty, save for a few receipts and an old jacket. It was clear he had gathered what he needed and left the rest behind, effectively erasing the most obvious trace of himself. The receipts told their own story. One was for a motel stay 2 nights before he left his daughter. Another was for prepaid phone cards, often used by those wishing to remain untraceable. And perhaps most concerning was the discovery that he had purchased a one-way ticket under a different name, though records showed he never actually boarded that bus. This raised more questions than answers. Had he changed his mind at the last minute, or was the ticket a diversion to throw investigators off his trail? As detectives pieced the puzzle together, the community of Willow Creek followed the developments with a mix of fascination and unease. What had driven a man who seemed so ordinary to take such extraordinary measures? Was it pure desperation from financial ruin, or was there something darker at play? The more investigators uncovered, the more it appeared that Mark had carefully orchestrated his disappearance, leaving just enough behind to mislead anyone trying to follow him. Meanwhile, his daughter remained at the center of the case. For many, the fact that he had abandoned her in a location where she would be found safely was both a relief and a haunting reminder of his mindset. It was as if he had drawn a sharp line. She was no longer part of his world, yet he wasn't willing to cause her direct harm. This contradiction only deepened the mystery. What kind of father plans so carefully to escape but makes sure his daughter isn't lost completely? Investigators began working with federal agencies, expanding the search beyond state borders. Rumors circulated that Mark may have connections out of the country, possibly distant relatives or acquaintances who could help him vanish for good. Each clue seemed to suggest he was always one step ahead, carefully anticipating what authorities might do. His calm, deliberate choices made it clear that this was not a man running blindly, but one who believed he had thought of everything. The investigation shifted focus from simply locating a missing father to uncovering the motive behind his escape. Why leave everything behind, including his child, and vanish without looking back? The answers remained elusive, but the growing trail of evidence made one thing clear. Mark Turner hadn't acted out of sudden despair. He'd been planning for weeks, maybe months, and his end goal was to disappear into a life that nobody in Willow Creek could have imagined. Weeks passed before the breakthrough finally came. After endless dead ends and false leads, investigators received a tip from a motel clerk in a small city several hundred miles away. The clerk remembered a quiet man who paid in cash, kept to himself, and used a different name on the registry. Surveillance footage confirmed what police suspected. The man was Mark Turner. He had altered his appearance slightly, cutting his hair shorter and growing a rough beard, but there was no mistaking who he was. When officers moved in, they found him sitting in the corner of a diner just down the street from the motel. There was no dramatic chase or fight. Mark surrendered without resistance, his face blank as if the weight of the search had already drained him. In his possession were only a few belongings, a duffel bag, some cash, and identification under a false name. The most unsettling detail was a folder containing bus schedules and flight information, evidence that he had been plotting his next move. Back in Willow Creek, news of his capture spread quickly. The story had already gripped the town, but now the full reality of his actions began to surface in court. Prosecutors revealed that Mark had carefully orchestrated his disappearance. He had liquidated what little he owned, withdrawn money in untraceable ways, and planned to slip out of the country. For him, abandoning his daughter wasn't an accident or even a sudden breakdown. It was part of his attempt to start a new life free of responsibility. What shocked many was the level of detail in his planning. He had scouted out locations, purchased supplies in advance, and even practiced using different names when checking into motels. This wasn't the behavior of a man overcome by desperation in a single moment. It was the behavior of someone who had decided long before that he wanted to leave his old life behind, no matter the cost. For the girl he left behind, the outcome was bittersweet. She was placed in the care of relatives who promised to give her the stability she needed. The image of her standing alone in that parking lot remained etched in the minds of everyone who had seen the footage. She was safe now, but the betrayal by her father left a wound that couldn't be erased easily. The community of Willow Creek was left shaken. Many who thought they knew Mark struggled to reconcile the man they once saw as an attentive father with the one who planned such a cold escape. The case became a constant reminder that appearances can be deceiving and that the people we trust most can sometimes carry the darkest secrets. When the trial concluded, Mark was sentenced for child abandonment and fraud, his carefully constructed new life collapsing before it could begin. His attempt to vanish had failed, but the echoes of his decision continued to linger. The story of the father who drove away from his own child became a lasting scar on the town, a chilling reminder that not all mysteries come from strangers lurking in the shadows. Sometimes they come from the people who live right next door.